This is BTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali and you are watching Fault Lines. It has been a very busy week in Afghanistan. Taliban have not been able to finalize the name of the government cabinet members and the process of reconciliation and negotiation continues. Meanwhile, the war in Panjshir Valley has not been decided as yet. There are many other problems that Afghanistan is facing, and top of the list is the economic crisis. The economic crisis of a country that does not have a very well-defined system of revenue. And the other major challenge is ISIS, that is a daunting threat for Afghanistan. Before we proceed any further, watch the package prepared by our team before I bring my first guest to the program.
World's current focus is on the unfolding situation in Afghanistan, in which the Taliban are in control practically the entire country, except Panjshir and Badakhshan. In the post-US withdrawal Afghanistan, there are a few decisive factors that would craft the contours of future trajectory of war-ravaged country in coming weeks. Amid the questions shaping Afghanistan's future, the fight against ISKP, the fate of anti-Taliban resistance and economic prospects of country would purportedly be defining factors. As the anti-Taliban resistant pocket braces for new fight, Taliban are gearing up to form new government. According to the Afghan broadcaster Dolo News, new government was imminent, while Taliban's official Ahmadullah Muttaqi said on social media that a ceremony was being prepared at the presidential palace in Kabul. The legitimacy of the new government in the eyes of the international donors and investors will be crucial for the economy as the country battles drought and the ravages of a conflict that took lives of an estimated 240,000 Afghans. Humanitarian organizations have warned of catastrophe as severe drought and the upheavals of war have forced thousands of families to flee their homes. In commendable effort to avert simmering humanitarian catastrophe in the country, United Nations will convene an international aid conference in Geneva on September 13, returning triumphant to Kabul 20 years after being expelled by a foreign force. The Taliban is now approaching other factions from the position of power. The only leverage left for the US and its Western allies is to try to pressure the Taliban by withholding international recognition or financial assistance. How successful that would be remains to be seen. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi reiterated that Pakistan would support any Afghan government that is backed by the people. Speaking at Pak Afghan Youth Forum's international conference titled Rebuilding Afghanistan Together, Zabiullah Mujahid, the spokesperson for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, heaped praise on Pakistan for its long-standing contributions towards the people of Afghanistan.
Ladies and gentlemen, my first guest in today's program is Dr. Waqar Ahmed. He is Deputy Executive Director of STPI, a famous and renowned economist of Pakistan. Dr. Saab, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And the reason we have invited you in today's program specifically is that you have written back-to-back 2 articles in Arab News. We read both of them and found that there is a lot of meat in these 2 articles to talk about. But before we talk about these articles, tell us about the basic structure of Afghan economy. There is a lot of discourse around the political administration, but very few people have so far addressed the economic crisis that Afghanistan is facing at the moment.
Yes, certainly. So before the Taliban took over, I think it's better to take a stock of the basic economic statistics where Afghan economy stood, you know. It's an almost $20 billion of economy according to the gross domestic product. They have decent foreign exchange reserves, however, lying in the US to the tune of $9 billion. The government budget which they manage, almost 80% of that is donor-led. So it is funded by development partners. They've managed to put in place a tax machinery, however, that only renders the rest of the 20% government expenditure which you have seen. Afghanistan has been trying to sort of raise its own production structures, manufacturing structures, bringing agriculture into value-added sectors, and processed food and agriculture industry is just about now starting to sort of take its roots, you know. But that is more aligned to meeting domestic needs. If you look at Afghanistan's exports, they are still under billion. Roughly, they range somewhere between $700 to $800 million, depending upon the year we are talking about. However, their import needs are substantially large, almost to the tune of $6 billion US dollars. So that leaves quite a large current account deficit in any single year. Having said this, of course, this is how the economy is functioning. The other aspect is about economic institutions, which are supposed to build the economy, take the momentum forward, the capacities at the central bank or the Ministry of Finance or the tax office, these were just being built in the past 4 or 5 years. We have seen Afghans take over from, if I can say, foreign consultants or advisors who used to run these institutions, However, due to the current uncertainty, we have seen many of them leave the country, including the governor of the central bank as well. And now, of course, there will be a new team which will be taking over the governance of these economic institutions.
So, Dr. Shab, you have also mentioned in your article, United Nations is publicly disseminating reports that the Taliban manage business operations worth $1.6 billion annually. That's unheard of. I mean, really, Taliban have the capacity to run economy as big as $1.6 billion.
Yes. So I think the way they've been trying to run, or the way the UN report tries to map their interests, was that they had pockets of business around Afghanistan, but a large part of this business is outside of Afghanistan. So you would have members of Taliban who conduct their business sitting in Dubai, for example, Pakistan maybe, or for that matter, any other third country, But at the end of the day, of course, they had some semblance of a corporate structure which was able to finance their operations over the longer term. And of course, those interests come from mining sectors, they come from small-scale manufacturing. They have tried to distance themselves from, for example, the illicit trade during the recent years. Even when they took over, they said that we want to distance ourselves from any sort of narco operations and others, which is good news for the global community.
Dr. Shab, I was going through a tweet by Mr. Atif Mia. He's a renowned economist of Pakistan. He says Afghanistan is experiencing the mother of all sudden stops, that is economic collapse, resulting from a sudden stop of foreign money. Which reminds me that when Taliban were last in control, there was no foreign aid coming to the country. The country was rather not even a part of any international financial monitoring mechanism. And now when Taliban are in the power again, there is a very different structure of economy in place, as you rightly mentioned. So tell us more about this economic collapse due to this sudden stop. What does this sudden stop mean, and how does it affect an economy?
Yes. So 3 things. I think, firstly, they cannot access the foreign exchange reserves, which actually belong to the Afghan people. Those reserves are lying in the Western banks, of course. However, as your package also rightly pointed out, the West would be better off keeping their promise, because the promise was that, yes, you allow us a safe exit from Afghanistan, and there will be financial assistance coming, including the IMF's additional assistance, which is due to come to Afghanistan. So that's one part of it. Second is that there are new players in the region who are now aligned with Taliban, unlike the previous time they came to power. So you have some promises, which of course Taliban have met Beijing, Taliban have been meeting in Moscow. There are some promises from other powers who were not in the canvas as such, or didn't have a helping hand towards Taliban during the mid-1990s, the episode which you're talking about. So there is going to be some shift in the portfolio, and there could be others who would help them, not only just Russia or China, but also neighboring economies as well. We have seen Qatar help them with their aviation affairs. Turkey is on record to have said that they would be discussing something as well. Then finally, I think Taliban themselves have tried to do 2 things. One is to give confidence that we will not disturb our trade and investment relations with the world. And you have seen this. Torkham has seen transit and bilateral trade resume within hours of their takeover. And there hasn't been any disruption in bilateral trade. Likewise with other neighbors of Taliban as well. But having said this, of course, Taliban also are mindful that many of the economic managers or the civil service, which was running this trade at the border, at dry ports, for example, or at the center, we may have lost them. So that challenge still remains, that they need to raise that economic team, at the meso and micro level.
Dr. very rightly pointed out, and that reminds me that after 1973, if Panjshir goes to Taliban, this will be the first time that the entire Afghanistan will be under one flag. So Afghanistan has not been under a collective national umbrella for that long. And as you have written in your article in Arab News dated 28th August, Economy and Business under Taliban, you have said 90% of Afghan population, which is living on less than $2 per day, face one of the worst bouts of inflation and food insecurity. So 90% population below the line of poverty and no infrastructure in place to connect them all into a national network. Doesn't it make the challenge altogether more cumbersome?
Absolutely. I think you're very right. And the fact that there's going to be temporary unemployment in Afghanistan, which is already set in, the link between growth and poverty, if growth can eventually bring people out of poverty, that link is employment. And that link is currently broken. And that will not just result in income poverty, that is going to result in food insecurities, in widening of various forms of inequalities as well. So I think this now brings the UN institutions who are there in Kabul, this brings them into picture. Now their responsibility certainly increases, and during the time people have lost their jobs or there's economic uncertainty until the time a new administration gives a new policy towards economic development, for example, these UN organizations need to run humanitarian affairs, one. Second, there has to be a coordinated effort. There's no doubt that you need a very superior donor coordination architecture on ground, because if there are pockets of food deficit, this food has to come from the neighbors. And while the neighbors are standing in to help, the needs assessment has to come out very quickly, which hasn't come about. So these are the concerns, and we really hope that UN plays their mandated role at this point.
Dr. Saab, you have also pointed out in the same article that Pakistan has a very dominant role in this entire picture. You pointed out that not only Pakistan has an important role with regards to the trade that Afghanistan is doing. The imports and exports are being done through Pakistan, but also they have high hopes from China, Pakistan Economic Corridor. But I fail to understand, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is connecting part of China with Gwadar. How does Afghanistan come into the picture? What is Afghanistan's stake into it, and how Afghanistan can get network to it, because Afghanistan is not exporting anything substantial, no industrial products. These are mere fruits, rugs, carpets and stuff like that.
That's a very good question. So again, two things here. First is that while we are saying that Afghanistan is a $20 billion economy, we are missing out on the potential which Afghanistan presents in terms of its natural resources, which are waiting to be harnessed. In fact, most of the Afghanistan hasn't been mapped for its natural resources, And before the resource curse sets in, it is going to be these conducive or friendly countries who are friendly towards Afghanistan, with whom Taliban are trying to make their linkages, because previously as well, as I said, they've been running operations in the mining sector very successfully in the pockets where they were. They're very keen to develop their mining sector going forward. Second is a low-hanging fruit, which is the connectivity dividend, on which China is very keen, Central Asia is very keen, Pakistan is very keen to really connect on the western side of Afghanistan, and see Afghanistan as a conduit between South Asia and Central Asia. The low-hanging fruit here is that you allow for once trade to resume through Afghanistan and just take the transit fee. And here you have an automatic source of revenue which will start to come in here. You've already seen the request from the government of Tajikistan, which wants to access its food supplies from Gwadar and Karachi via the Wakhan, and willing to pay that transit fee to Afghanistan. So it's these kinds of innovative sources of income which Taliban are looking into, and this sort of automatically connects with the BRI ambition of China, which to some extent was sort of facing a slowdown in this part of the world because there was large investment in Pakistan. Iran had agreed to large investment as part of BRI, but Afghanistan was nowhere in picture. Now with situation more clear and Taliban engaging directly with Beijing, Afghanistan, and they've come out very openly, they're now willing to be part of the BRI process.
And Dr. Shab, on 9th August, you have written another article in Arab News, Afghanistan's endgame economic implication for Pakistan. I have read it, but for the sake of convenience of those who have not read, briefly, what are the major implications for Pakistan with the peace process settling down in Afghanistan?
Yes, I think there are three areas where Pakistan had been very interested in the past decade and a half. One was direct investment in Afghanistan, and you have very strong business groups inside Pakistan who wanted to invest in food, in pharmaceuticals, in construction sector. They really wanted to go in there, but due to the anti-Pakistan sentiment in Kabul during this past decade and a half, our business groups could not operate. In fact, they weren't even allowed to do the routine hiring operations, which other countries such as India were able to do, and India's FMCGs, fast-moving consumer good industries, could move in fairly quickly. So that's one. Second is trade. So a large part of trade was consciously being given to countries in South Asia, which were much further away at the cost of paying a higher distance cost, Now, of course, you have seen the production being ramped up in industries in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. We have recently heard from a report from Hattar Industrial Estate, from Jamrud Industrial Estate, who are now sort of sending the same things which were coming from countries farther away. So that's second, the trade dividend, But third, I think, is the transboundary trade in energy. And that's where I think Pakistan is now boasting a surplus energy capacity, at least in electricity now. And I have tried to make a case that with very prudent governance in the energy sector, this surplus electricity which Pakistan now has the capacity of, the dividends of this can be shared with Afghanistan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saab. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break here and join back with the second segment of our program. Stay with us. Welcome back. As I said in the introduction of the program, that the second largest threat for Afghanistan today is militancy and terrorism. While militancy and terrorism has always been associated with Taliban, now Taliban being in government, two back-to-back bomb blasts in Kabul city remind the entire world that the terrorism remains to be a problem, despite the fact that now Taliban are in charge of the affairs. According to the statement given by US President, there is a new organization known as ISISK, that is ISIS Khorasan faction, active since 2015, said to be responsible beyond these attacks. I've invited Dr. Mansoor Umar Khan. He's a professor of IR from Air University, has done his doctorate in international relations from Kassel University in Germany. Doctor, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
And we are here talking about the serious threat of ISIS in Afghanistan. So while we were discussing Afghanistan in totality in the past, we never thought ISIS to be a serious threat. How serious this threat looks to you, being an expert of the subject?
I think it's a threat that has to be taken serious. Just a few days ago, the U.S. General Kenneth McKenzie, actually in an interview mentioned that he himself believes that this threat is very serious, and he was, kind of vindicative in the way he was talking, and he was saying that the Taliban are going to have a tough job ahead of them because this organization, is going to try to disrupt everything, try to disrupt the government, try to attack civilians. They have already a terrible track record of, they blew up a hospital in Kabul not too long ago. Then, the airport, all these things, it's...
also attacked on a school that
right.
We saw many small girls were being taught there, and they were among the casualties.
Yes, they're absolutely ruthless. And we have seen this in the past as well. If we go back to, for example, Libya, where the Obama administration had to admitted that they used Al-Qaeda, against Gaddafi. So they're using those terrorists, which allegedly they're fighting against. And then if we go back to Iraq, we have ISIS there, Al-Nusra Front. This is basically a creation of the US, of the CIA. This is not, this is an open secret among those who, study this. So they're going to use these proxy terrorists, so to speak, to upset the situation in Afghanistan and to make it look like the Taliban are incapable of governing. And then again, they may have an opening to get back into the country, and they may have an excuse, a pretext for that. And like I said, this has been repeated in their wars in Libya.
But Dr. Sab, even in its hometown, even in its heartland, that is Syria, ISIS has lost rounds against the coalition led by Iran and Syrian government and Russia, and they have not demonstrated any substantial strength thereafter. So how do you think in Afghanistan, where they do not apparently hold any specific piece of land, how serious threat would that be for Taliban, who are now in charge of almost everything?
Well, it goes actually a bit further than that. For example, there is evidence that the U.S. has contacts within the Taliban. There are different factions also. The Taliban is not one monolithic bloc that operates in that way. So they will try to play off one faction against the other, even within the Taliban. And they have said this actually in certain statements that have come out. Analysts have said this. So we should not underestimate their capability. And again, as was said before, by The Economist, that the Taliban are going to depend a lot on foreign aid, foreign grants, loans. All this was what the U.S. has primarily been doing. So it's not that simple, I believe. They're going to use both these proxies, so to speak, and these militant groups, and their economic power in Afghanistan. So I believe that this is not going to be easy for the Taliban. Their biggest hope is China in that sense, as was already pointed out. If they can get the mines working, there's about 3 trillion of US dollars worth of all sorts of minerals, from copper to lithium to gold, so many different really strategic type of minerals. If they can get that working, they could find some independence economically speaking.
So, Dr. Shab, is this the reason that Taliban have said in a press statement that China is going to be one of the countries that is going to help Afghanistan economically, and because China has always needed these metals for its ever-growing industrial empire. Do you think it's a very logical connectivity between the two that can also benefit neighboring country Pakistan?
Yes, I believe you're absolutely right there. I mean, the Taliban, if you look at it historically, they have always kind of tried to play their resources. Back then, if we go before 9/11, they were not only trying to deal with Unicol, the U.S. Gas company, construction company, they were also with Bridas, which was an Argentinian company, and they were planning to play the game on both sides, playing one off against the other to see what best deal they could get. They're doing a similar thing, I think, now with China, and maybe to some extent, let's see how Russia may fit into the picture. But certainly China, they're trying to, tell the U.S. in that sense that, we don't depend only on this. And again, they're quite conscious of their mineral wealth, and they want to get that going. And I think that's where the U.S. is also feeling a bit maybe insecure, that if China comes in, and there's another plan to use Afghanistan, if the Chinese can use Afghanistan and use their own pipelines, they can go to Iran. And Iran has the second largest gas reserves in the world, and they have plenty of oil, as we all know. So that's another strategy they may be using. And then, as you said, to make Afghanistan truly a hub of Central Asia and South Asia, especially Pakistan, that would be a win-win situation for everyone involved in this region, except for the U.S. Americans, of course.
I'll come back to this one later, Dr. but it's a very pertinent question, and you being the subject expert can perhaps help us to understand it better. So 20 years of war, $2 trillion spent, at some time more than 300,000 boots on ground. Use of ruthless, brute kinetic force that has killed, I don't know how many, hundreds and thousands of people on the both sides of the borders. At some point, they were also bombing inside Pakistan as well. Has not yielded any result. At any stage, United States has not been able to have the occupancy, to have the administrative control of entire Afghanistan, leaving it to Taliban finally. And Taliban, meanwhile, in just matter of a month or a month and a half, have control of almost the entire country, something the most powerful army of the world has not been able to do at any point in the last 20 years. Now, my question here is, do you think this being clubbed with all previous wars that they have fought after the Gulf War that you were talking about in the previous program, do you believe that it is end of era of hard power for United States that has been tremendously counting on its military abilities to settle international disputes?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I believe we have to, although, look at the military-industrial complex. If you go before around 2001, you look at the stock of Boeing, of Raytheon, of General Dynamics, Grumman, Northrop, all those companies, that stock has gone up 10 times or more, So the military-industrial complex was very much in favor of keeping this war going. One could question, what are the results on the ground, because it didn't look favorable for the U.S. since this war started, basically. They had a quick victory over the Taliban, and then it was just, it seemed like a war of attrition that would just go on and on and on. But the military-industrial complex can never be counted out. They made a huge killing, so to speak, and they got filthy rich off of it. But now, of course, U.S. military power is seen the world over as not very effective, as you pointed out. In Iraq already, it didn't seem that well. They fought for many years there. Then you had Afghanistan, of course. These two wars seem to point out that the hard military kinetic power cannot do that much, actually, which is somewhat surprising. But I think that what the U.S. is trying to do now is they're trying to be a bit more clever about it and use those proxy forces. It's ISIS in Afghanistan, and as they have done before, they've used them as an excuse in Syria, they've used them in Iraq to split the country. If we look at Iraq in the last war, of course, you saw that what the U.S. did, and the British as well, was using these so-called the terrorists to fight Shia against Sunni, to split them off, to divide and rule and divide and conquer. And then in the north, they would create an almost autonomous province, of the Kurds. This was what they were doing, to really split up the country. And they're going to try to do something of that sort, I'm pretty sure, in Afghanistan, because the big threat is BRI and CPAC and Russia coming in, and they're going to, that could be seen as a huge loss. China is definitely making inroads. inroads. And if Russia also comes, then the US is going to ask itself, what did we fight for 20 years and killed 500,000 people, 500,000 people, mostly, of course, Afghans, and over 70,000 of those were civilians. 3,000 is the number given for the casualties, or 2,800 of the US service members. But I think that's far too low. I think that's a very doctored number. I think that China and Russia can be seen as beneficiaries, but then again, we cannot discount this threat of ISIS and other groups. And then again, as I've said, they have already infiltrated the Taliban. I mean, they've been there for 20 years, this local US elite and the US elite in the US. One cannot underestimate the leverage that they have, and we know how corrupt even members of the Taliban have been, going back to the 1990s. And then, of course, the Hamid Karzai government was no better. They were probably even worse. So these connections there, this gives the U.S.
Nonetheless,
leverage.
corruption has been a problem when it comes to Afghanistan, Dr. But what you pointed out regarding United States strategy, so how do you compare this with China's model of economic partnership? Because, and I'm saying this because the first statement given regarding this regional powers from Taliban was with regards to China. They said they're looking towards China to build a partnership, to build up infrastructure, to build up industry, and to capitalize on the mineral resources of the nation. So this means that whatever influence United States could not buy with all these amount of money and time spent, China has it with, even before getting the foot on ground. How do you compare this IR strategy, this diplomatic strategy of China, of creating a softer influence on nations like Afghanistan?
I think China has been quite clever, I'm sure they've studied the region in Afghanistan, and they know that foreign invaders have never really succeeded, whether it's the British, whether it's the Russians, or even the US now. And I think they're clever, and they want to do business. This is their view. And it has been said by many analysts that the United States is going about its politics in a more destructive manner, because it has, of course, it's still the only remaining superpower, and it has a tremendous military power. But China is more constructive, and they're more willing to build things and build infrastructure and business and connectivity and all that. And so I think the Chinese are really seizing the moment, so to speak. They have seen that the United States militarily hasn't really gotten anywhere there, except enriching a few individuals of the military-industrial complex and the capitalists back in the US. But that's a few people that have always been rich already. But the Chinese are more into, as re-establishing that, what they call BRI, this ancient Silk Route, and they want it to be in a very inclusive project if they can, and Afghanistan as a hub here with that tremendous mineral wealth. And also they have a lot of gas and oil. The Russians really did the geological surveys back in the 1980s when they were in Afghanistan fighting. They also did that. So we know that there's a tremendous mineral wealth.
Untapped mineral wealth.
Dr.
How, in your opinion, Pakistan is going to be affected eventually when Taliban take control? Because not a matter of if or but. It is only a matter of time when Taliban are going to take control of entire of Afghanistan. How do you, from your own standpoint, see this development for Pakistan?
I think that is, a very good question. One has to be quite skeptical in certain ways because, as was already pointed out, in Kabul and in general, the Afghan political elite has gotten this idea that Pakistan overplayed its hand with the Taliban, that they had a big role that they played, and they didn't like this interference. So Pakistan has to be careful now not to repeat the same mistakes. We have to, or Pakistan has to respect the sovereignty of Afghanistan, and it's not just the Pashtuns, everyone in Afghanistan, And this strategic depth, I think it also backfired, because as the other guest was saying, your economist, that Pakistan business was losing out there while the Indians were gaining. So they have to play their cards quite carefully. They have to be very mindful and respectful of Afghani sovereignty. And again, we also, we have a border issue still. The Durand line was never accepted by an Afghan government. So one has to be very careful here. But I think if the cards are played right, then Pakistan can gain and can win to a certain extent.
But Dr. Saab, what you have just pointed out were all because of the massive influence of the Indian lobby in the power corridors of Afghanistan, of particularly Kabul. And now when we have Taliban that are supposedly very close to Pakistan's diplomatic point of view, don't you think these issues will dilute, and both the countries are a lot interdependent on each other when it comes to prosperity and development of this region?
Yes, certainly. They are, next door neighbors, so to speak, and there's certainly a great economic potential between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Afghanistan needs Pakistan. It's a landlocked country. It doesn't have an outlet to the Indian Ocean. It needs it. Otherwise, it has to go via Iran. But there have been, religious and other differences and political differences with Iran. So I think this is a definite opportunity for Kabul and Islamabad to get a trade going, to get investments into Afghanistan. Pakistan had invested in the past, but it wasn't really enough in that sense. And India always bested Pakistan's effort because simply they had more capital. But now if China also comes into play, and China is of course a big ally of Pakistan, then I think that could be a triangular relationship with China kind of literally paving the way, paving the roads and the infrastructure, and then Pakistan and Afghanistan also benefiting from that. That would be a very good scenario for the whole region, really.
Doctor, being an expert of American foreign policy, what do you think America's foreign policy is going to be toward Pakistan now when its interest from Afghanistan is almost over? It doesn't have any military power left there. Not any on-ground engagement is left in Afghanistan. They are diplomatically engaging through Qatar and through Doha, but as a matter of fact, there are no American stakes left on ground physically. So what do you think is going to be America's strategy toward Pakistan? Will it allow Pakistan just to become a more stronger partner of China and turn it back toward Pakistan? Or will the United States try to capitalize on Pakistan being a strong country in this region and would like to remain a country of influence when it comes to Pakistan?
I think you have to look at the bigger picture, so to speak, here, because the US and the UK are very much worried about the BRI, and that is connected to CPAC, obviously, and that they would be displaced in this region of the world, which is, as Zbigniew Brzezinski, an insider of US politics, of course, pointed out, there's something like 75% of the world, 75% of the world population, I think he said, lives in this area, which is called Euro-Asia, and 60% of the GNP is generated from here about. So I think the US has already shifted towards India, and we've seen this in the past couple decade or longer, decade and a half. And I think they're going to continue with this strategy simply because they see China and then in the background Russia as the greatest competitors. And this is what some people have called a new great game that's going to be and is being played already. And Afghanistan plays this pivotal role as a hub and with tremendous resources. And I think that, yeah, they're going to, invest, so to speak, in India, and they want to use India as a pivot against this whole Belt and Road initiative. And that's going to be their strategy. And this proxy, ISIS and terrorism, they've done that in the past. There's no reason to believe that they're going to let that go because it's one of their leveraging points, and I think they're going to try to do that to disrupt, again, BRI and the CPAC, and that would be seen as a great victory for them. Contrary to that, if BRI gets going and is a success story, then they would feel that they have been, almost ousted from this region of the world that's so productive and so, not only in world population, but has tremendous resources and a tremendous potential, as we've seen, the rise of Japan already, the rise of China, and then others, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, they're all
case studies of the same. Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Saab. Ladies and gentlemen, it's very important for us to understand that war does not determine who is right. War only determines who is left. Afghanistan, a country where 90% of the population is living below the line of poverty and earns less than $2 a month, is a country where abject poverty has become the most severe kind of violence. Afghanis have to be pulled out, the people of Afghanistan have to be pulled out of this crisis. They require help and support from all regional powers. That includes Pakistan. Pakistan is doing its best. As you might have seen in the introduction of my program, Prime Minister Imran Khan has also made a request to the global community to come forward and to play a more assertive role in the rebuilding of Afghanistan. Because if Afghanistan is not rebuilt now, it might just get too late. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.
बचपन में कागज के जहाज उड़ाना, गली में हाथों को यूं फैलाना कि जैसे अभी हवा में उड़ जाएंगे। बड़ों से सुने आलम और रफीकी के किस्से, कुछ उन्हीं जैसा कर जाने का जुनून।